When our post-everything world has turned life upside down, how do you even know which end is up?
If you're committed to a community or a cause greater than yourself, you don't have the luxury of checking out or the freedom to burn out.
It's not enough to just keep surviving. We need to thrive again.
This is Post Everything,
A podcast about remapping culture and rethinking leadership in a liminal age. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Post Everything. This is Brad, and I'm here with my friend John, and we are back.
We're so back. Our last episode dropped in May of 2025, and here we are after some months off. And it's interesting, Brad, I went back this morning and I listened to our last episode from May of 2025, but then I went all the way back and listened to our very first episode from March of 2023. And it's very interesting to hear what we were asking in episode 1 and then how we were talking about things in May of 2025, some months ago. And a lot has happened even since our last episode in May. Some big news. Your book came out in April, and I think you have an announcement.
John, in the end of October, I was shocked to get an email that from Christianity Today letting me know that my book, The Reason for Church, was selected to be Christianity Today's Book of the Year. Woohoo! And so, yeah, it's pretty crazy. I think I'm still in shock, and it's really cool. And praise God that there are to back up a little bit. This was not a book that I think most people were like, man, I really need a book about like why the church is awesome.
Yeah.
Right? That's still not a thing. But it turns out that there are a whole lot of people who are actually like wrestling with that very thing. And I knew it was a need, but I didn't know that there would be this many people who were actually interested in it and felt the need for some help or resources for that. So that's just really encouraging. And validating personally, but also like hopeful. Like, thank God people are feeling the need for this, and that means something good is happening in the midst of all of the insane change that we've been in the midst of. So, yeah.
Well, congratulations. It's a great book. I know you worked hard on it, and it came through a lot of your own wrestles and trying to figure out what's going on here and how do I make sense of both the culture and the church. And I think it's a gift to the church. And so congratulations.
Well, and John, you have a project going on right now too.
Yeah. During the time off, I actually started a podcast here at Spanish River Church. We call it Rooted by the River. It's the Spanish River Parenting Podcast, and just been trying to help make sense of the cultural moment, but also work on what are some best practices for parents and tell some stories of how God is at work in families. And so it's very different from Post Everything, but I'm trying to take the lessons that we've learned in Post Everything and put them into practice in this other podcast. So I'm very excited about that.
That's awesome.
Another big announcement is that we are launching a new season of Post Everything, season 6. Can you believe it? Season 6.
It's wild.
And the cool thing is that we are not only going to be audio, we are going to be on YouTube. So people are going to have to see what we look like. And
yeah, that was the biggest takeaway there. We're just actually, catching up with everybody else. So it's awesome. But John, what are we digging into today?
Well, as we've been reflecting over the past few months and had a break, which has been really good, a break from the podcast is really helpful just for us to get our curiosity back and think about where we wanted to go. But one of the things that we landed on was like going back to just even the foundations of the podcast. Post Everything is a podcast about remapping culture and rethinking leadership in a liminal age. And we continue to live through liminality. What was true of culture is no longer true. We're not where we were in 2021 even. We're in a different place. But what's next is still unclear. We were talking about how all the data points are different, and we're not even sure what the XY graph looks like anymore. Since we launched in March of 2023, we've asked a lot of questions, and we use that phrase new normal and unprecedented a lot. But it almost feels like we're in, yeah, we did. We almost feel like we have to examine what the new normal is. Our society is living through not just a liminal season, but liminality might be the only constant. Yeah, we're going to dig into that.
Yeah, and I think as we were talking about, like, okay, how do we describe this? Because this is what John, what you're introducing here is around the kind of ongoing liminality that feels like there's been we use the language of a vibe shift, but it does feel like the nature of the change is shifting. Like it's not the same kind of change. It's almost like we've taken a turn off of one highway onto another, and it's still a highway, it's still change, but it feels like we're going in a slightly different direction, and there's a very different kind of landscape and scenery that's flying past us as we go. And so how do we describe that? And I think what I kind of landed on is just this idea that liminality and the liminal culture, the transition that we're in the thick of, is becoming more complex and more diverse. And we're not quite as synced up as we used to be. And let me kind of give an example of that. So, John, you know that I've been doing a little bit of speaking around the book. And for one of the talks I did in St. Louis, did a lunch with about a dozen pastors. And it was great. It was fun. It was encouraging. But there was one guy I was talking to afterward, and he was saying, like, this book is helpful. Like what you're describing here is just really resonates with my experience. And he's like, if you don't mind, I'd love to describe kind of like some of the challenges I'm just in the thick of. And maybe you can tell me how your book would like speak to this. Like, give me some advice, please. And I was like, I'm not sure if that's a great idea, but sure. And what he described, the further down the rabbit hole he went, I realized, like, man, this guy is describing all of the dynamics and situations that I thought I was just in the thick of, and was really wrestling with in like 2019 through 2021. And what was kind of surprising about that is I think I've been assuming that a lot of the things that you and I, John, are thinking about now are like everybody's thinking about that, right? And
right.
That what we had talked about at the beginning of the Post Everything, actually, like, that's a little bit out of date in some ways, and I actually don't know that that's necessarily true. And I don't think it's because like we're advanced and we have moved on, but I think that there was something unique about the pandemic that really synced us all up in a sense that we were all experiencing change simultaneously and in similar ways. We were handling it differently. We were responding differently. Different contexts across the country were responding differently, and as a group, and that's all the case. But I think our perception of like where culture is very different now. I don't even think most of us agree on like where we're going now. It's not just things are changing and we're seeing different things. I think we're going in different directions, maybe even.
Yeah.
And it's hard to put that, put your finger on that and explain that, but it's not being synced up that way feels very related to almost like a fracturing of our epistemology, a fracturing of how we determine what's true. We're not doing it in the same way anymore.
Correct.
And how we make sense of the world, or what we view as sources of meaning and significance and purpose in life, like even that may be fracturing at a deeper level than we thought. And downstream, if that is true, that means that kind of like where we're going is maybe even more unpredictable in some ways than we thought, like the limits might have been.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this a little bit, and I've been thinking about how the average person makes sense of what reality is. So the average person is exposed to tons of information online, through social media, whatever they're watching on YouTube. And that exposure to tons of information gives us this sense that we know what's going on. Take a current event, take a political thing that's going on. Like, we're fed information online and we get a sense of like, okay, I know what's going on and I've got a take on reality, and my take on reality is correct. But then we start to dig a little bit deeper and we start thinking about, well, what's feeding our take on reality is our algorithmic influence. We are exposed to things that are curated by an algorithm. The other night I was with my wife and she was talking about how she didn't like necessarily what she was seeing on YouTube. And I was like, let me reset your algorithm. And she's like, okay. But she's like, I really like the videos of sheep getting sheared. It's very relaxing to watch that. And I watched one with her. I'm like, it actually is pretty cool. But I reset it, and she's like, my algorithm got reset. I was like, just search sheep shearing again, and it'll pop back up. But you said in terms of the algorithm, we don't really know how it works, but it's designed to confirm our worst fears, justify our outrage, and connect dots that context would otherwise make unreasonable. Yeah.
No, and not only that, but like we forget, especially when you're scrolling through a news feed, that you're not reading or consuming information about events. You are consuming other people's the meaning that people have made about other information about events. Like there's an additional subjective layer there. And that's always been the case. Like any journalist that you look to is going to be like they are filtering news through their own personal perspective. Like being completely objective is actually impossible. But a journalist is still trained to resist the pure subjectivity that the average person like has no kind of filter or speed bump or guardrails for. And so it's unmitigated perception of events, not the events itself. And that when you confuse that, that's part of what's fracturing that epistemology like you're talking about, is because we're confusing our experience of events and the events themselves.
Yes. And so if you go back, if you're listening, you go back and listen to the last episode of season 5, we talk about this a little bit, but not only are the people who are mediating those events to us not necessarily trained in how to do that and how to be as objective as possible. I don't even think they're trying to, because they want their interpretation of the event to be the interpretation. It's a power play even in that. So
that's the incentives shaping the way that we're engaging online and how we're framing these events. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was thinking this morning, because I was like, there's the online algorithmic influence, but then I was like, each person lives their life in the physical world. They have real relationships face to face. They have real conversations face to face. It's almost like each person has a real world algorithm. And then I was like, no, you dummy, you've just been out of church planting too long. That's called context, right? Every person has a context that they live in, where there's conversations and experiences that they have. And so in a very strange way, those two things play off of each other, and I think give us perception of the world that may or may not be accurate. Actually, I'll say this, I don't think it is accurate. So we've talked about contextual flattening, how through social media and online, there's a loss of nuance. Often what goes viral is the thing that has the lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
When you are having a conversation with somebody, like maybe you're a pastor like us, you're in a church, you grab coffee with them. Part of the context for that conversation is going to be like, wow, there are people who are overhearing us. So like that's going to shape like how we converse, and maybe we're not going to speak as loudly, or maybe we're going to like not talk about really sensitive and vulnerable things in a public space. Like that is a context that is shaping how we communicate. Social media both lacks all context whatsoever. So you don't get any of that if you're like, hey, I had this conversation with somebody. You don't get any of that context when they're tweeting about it, right? But also it introduces a flattened context of the news feed. So you're viewing, reports about, decisions made by Congress this week side by side with, for example, sheep shearing videos. That cannot help, because the medium is the message, that cannot help but reduce the authority of the congressional decision, and or maybe raise the authority of the sheep shearing videos. I don't know, like that sounds a little bit weird, but when you're getting hot takes side by side with actual like accurate information, you can't, like, your brain needs context to differentiate between the two. And so that actually has an impact on our ability to discern what is true, good, or beautiful. And it's shaping our lens on that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think these two things play off each other. So I feel like on this podcast, maybe we have explored a little bit more how the algorithm affects how we view the physical in-person world. But I'm also starting to be curious about how the physical in-person world affects what we look for online. And I don't have any, I haven't read any studies on that. There's no articles, but I'm just curious more the play off of these two things and how they give us a sense of what we know about the world and how true that is. Because we have so much information coming at us, we have to make sense of things. And so we often put things into categories without all the information, and we become certain about them. We think in terms of story, and we try and make meaning related to that.
Yeah. No, the point about story is really important because, the gospel is good news, but news is more than data. The good news of Jesus comes in the context of redemptive history, of millennia of foreshadowing, and countless stories of God's people leading up to that point where they all experience the longing and the need of a savior. And so it's good news because it comes in the midst of a tension of this, original creational good, a broken and fallen world, and then redemption comes breaking in. But now we're still at the place of the story that we're in. We're in an already but not yet tension and waiting for the consummation and restoration of all things, right? So we are storied creatures. That's an image bearer thing, and it's especially a Christian thing. But mere data is not a story. And we think that what we're doing and this is not just social media, this is everything online. What we're doing is we're consuming data. And when we do so, our brains, just the way as storied creatures, we are trying to put it in the context of a story.
Yeah.
Right. And that story is shaped by the liturgies of physical in-person daily life. And it's also influenced and shaped by the digital liturgies that we are exposed to online. And the challenge that pastors everywhere and any institutional leader really is like, how do we keep the in-person narrative and story and context to be primary? Because over time, the reason we need to touch grass is because the algorithm is a story in the background of your news feed that is shaping and telling a story that is basically we've talked about this before. It's inducing main character syndrome, where we think we are the center of the story because it's a story written and designed all around our user experience and trying to increase our engagement. And so that's not good news. That's not a good news story.
Well, I think the anxiety of how of the liminality of the age forces us to try and become certain about the data points and therefore construct the story that we're in. And yet I think we actually have a less accurate system of figuring out what reality is than we did pre-social media, pre-online world. And what's been interesting is I sense that there's two things that shouldn't be happening at the same time that are happening. One is, as events continue to unfold and change what we think is possible in reality. For instance, when Charlie Kirk was assassinated and that was caught on video, I mean, the effect that had both on the left and right was incredible in terms of
eliciting a response.
Listening response. So there's these events that cause massive anxiety. And yet at the same time, I find that people seem more certain of what they believe with less information about it. There's been this galvanizing of opinions about the world, about the other side, about what reality is, with a less openness to consider other opinions, and possibly even a less accurate understanding of what their own opinion is based on. And so, confirmation bias is a thing, and it's a thing for everybody. But I find that people are almost like completely, this is anecdotal, but it seems that sometimes people are completely unaware that there's another way of viewing things. It's like their anxiety's higher and they're more certain at the same time. I don't know if you've seen that.
Oh, no, I mean, yes. And my kind of especially pastoral read on that is that what social media does is it keeps us in such a, it keeps our lizard brain in such a perpetual state of fight or flight and constant low grade anxiety that simultaneously, one, it's hard to even recognize that in ourselves because it's such an ongoing state, but because we're not able to absorb all of the information that bombards our brains on a daily basis. But also, like, even if you do try to keep up, it's not possible, right? But also, certainty is a symptom of like a desperation. Like anxiety is a result of ambiguity and all of this change in the liminality that we're describing, right? Certainty is a very natural, understandable, but problematic response to that anxiety, because what it's trying to do is like, I need something that's certain and sure that I can hang my hat on and not have to be living in a state of like confusion and ambiguity. And so that actually makes complete sense that would be the response. And that's why certainty is replacing, in a lot of ways, not just nuance, but also openness to
curiosity,
to other perspectives. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the posts that I felt was really helpful from, I can't remember the name of the woman who's a leader in Braver Angels, but she suggested the question, asking people what they were afraid of over the last few months. And I thought that's actually really an excellent question, because you do know that. You kind of do know what you're afraid of, or at least that question helps you get there. But it also is a very human question that takes us out of that like certainty of who's right and who's wrong, and evil's out there but not in me. And it really taps into the Imago Dei in each and every person, because I think it's very hard to unpack for people. How do you know that what you believe is true? Well, this goes back to what you said about the sheep shearing videos going alongside with political commentary. I saw the sheep get sheared, right? I saw the event happen and the interpretation of it.
One is very soothing and calming, and the other one is the exact opposite. Yeah.
And in my mind, they're both real. So
yeah.
that's very hard. But I think that's an interesting thing to think about as we think about change, liminality, how we're making meaning and how we're coming to know the things that we believe are true about the world.
No, that's exactly right. And so just to maybe zoom back out a little bit, because I think you just did a really good job of describing the experience of the last several months to a year in a lot of ways. And so the question then is, okay, if this feels different from that era of the pandemic and we're not synced up anymore, what is the catalyst? Like, what's going on there? And I think that, like, this is my hypothesis, John. I could be wrong about this, but it really feels like what we're experiencing is the front end of a similarly potent and global, at least nationwide, but it's probably global as well.
Don't say pandemic. Don't say pandemic.
No, well, I gotta say the word to make the comparison, John.
Okay.
On par with the pandemic.
Okay.
A catalyst for change and ongoing liminality, deepening and more complex liminality, and that is artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Right. I think as you and I were talking about season 6, we were like, we don't want to do another season on artificial intelligence for a couple of reasons. Number one, the one we did, I think, has aged extremely well, because we weren't talking about like current controversies or, the advancements of AI. We were talking about like, can we talk about the anthropology that we need a better grasp on to understand how AI is going to affect us? And that is even more relevant now than it was when we did it. And I think we're going to revisit the AI topic and themes a lot during season 6. But it really felt like when we were, it's 2023 when we did that season. It was season 2, John. The wheels at that time were just starting to spin up around AI.
Yeah.
It was a conversation. We kind of felt like we were going a little bit on the ledge. Like, I hope we're not overreacting. Turns out we were underreacting.
That conversation we had. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think we recorded that one too. Yeah, absolutely. But if anything, it's sped up since then. right? A lot. And now it very much feels like we're kind of on the cusp of, some people might say like that's going to happen in the next year. Or it might take 3 to 5 years for what feels like us towing off the edge of a cliff into remarkable transformational change. And so we don't really know what that means. That's the whole kind of spirit of this podcast, John, as we talk about all the time. And you mentioned recovering some curiosity at the very beginning here. That's because, thank you for listening, but John and I are doing this actually for selfish reasons, which is we're trying to figure out which end is up and how do we navigate this. And to whatever degree this is helpful for people, that's awesome. But I really do think that, if I were going to write another chapter in my book, and especially part 1, where I'm talking about church defeaters, these cultural beliefs and assumptions that preclude our attachment or commitment to a church, if there was one more chapter I'd write in that, it would be on AI. Because I think AI is the next major church defeater and also defeater belief, a la Tim Keller's The Reason for God. Because it is going to introduce, and it is already introducing, a brand new plausibility structure.
Yeah.
Now, that term plausibility structure is kind of a technical term. It means that like a plausibility structure is like an environment or an ecosystem or a tool, media, institution, whatever, that makes new things possible. Like it's an imagination generation machine, right? Social media is a plausibility structure. It's a whole slew of plausibility structures in some way. And AI is about to say, hold my beer to Mark Zuckerberg. So, let's just ask one question. Like, here's an example of it. Could AI ever become, is it even possible actually to reach AGI or artificial general intelligence or ASI, artificial super intelligence? Is it actually a thing that a series of ones and zeros extrapolated to like incredible complexity could feasibly become an actual conscious, sentient entity? That question, in some ways, the answer to that question is of secondary importance to the fact that we're asking that question. The fact that we're asking the question is evidence itself that the existence of AI at all is introducing a new plausibility structure, because that question is a statement of what was not plausible before and now is. The fact that we're trying to actually wrestle with that. Right.
Yeah.
And also the answer, in some ways, the answer doesn't matter because we've been conditioned for the last 10 or 15 years to interact with actual human beings across the planet through text-based communication and a screen. And so when AI is simply replacing a person on the other end of it, it is for sure going to feel, and our experience of AI, even if it is just basically a really complicated and skillful statistical probability machine, like even if that is the case, our experience of it is as if it is an entity, if it's an actual intelligence and not just an artificial one.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I get what you're saying.
So if that's the case, how in the world do we determine what's true? If it was hard with a social media newsfeed, how much more difficult and how much more is our epistemology going to be scrambled because we are interacting with a digital equation that seems to be, as a human, speaking as if it has certainty. And in all of the anxiety that we were just talking about, it communicates with certainty, the certainty that we are longing for and grasping onto in desperation. We're not in a good place to handle this well. And the implication of that is, by the way, like if you want a good introductory podcast to artificial intelligence, you need to check out this newer podcast. It's called The Last Invention. The title of the podcast comes from this idea that a whole lot of people who are designing and creating AI in Silicon Valley are convinced that what they are creating is the last invention, because every subsequent invention that humanity will need is actually going to be created by AI and not by human beings. And man, you guys have heard us talk about Andy Crouch's book, Culture Making, and how He quotes Ken Meyer's definition of culture as what humans make of the world. Imagine if we didn't have to make anything of the world again. Are we going to, like, you think we're in a meaning crisis now? Imagine if everyone around you said, no, we have an AI for that. We don't need to make culture anymore. This is not sustainable, right? As you can tell, I'm a little bit of a doomer when it comes to AI. But what is certain, what that looks like, if we're going to get there, we have no idea. But what is certain is between here and there, it's going to involve an even greater and more prolonged liminality. At the beginning of the most recent episode from The Last Invention, episode 8, the two co-hosts talk about how they went to this UN-sponsored conference in Europe, and one of the sound bites at the very beginning of the episode is a speaker saying this, and I could not agree with this more. She said, AI is here, and you could agree that we are in a new reality where we need to recognize not just the pace, but the permanence of change. And I think that's right. I think that's what we're kind of towing off the edge of the cliff of. And so if that's the case, okay, what do we do with that, right? John, as we were talking about this, this conversation we're having right now, that I remembered a really helpful article, speaking of Andy Crouch, that was written during the pandemic, early in the pandemic, where he said, the pandemic could represent a snowstorm, it could be a blizzard, or it could be an ice age. And his thesis is basically like, the speed of this black swan event and how completely it consumed the entire planet is interesting in that it's going to be really hard to tell if we're in a storm or a blizzard or an ice age, but depending on which kind of inhospitable season we're in, it really determines how we lead differently. And we need to lead differently. If you are leading if you're in an ice age and you're leading as if it's a blizzard or a snowstorm, then you're going to be really unprepared. And I think we're looking at an ice age of liminality. And so we've got to be prepared to make sense of the world around us when we're in a state of constant liminality. And so, John, like you mentioned Charlie Kirk earlier.
Yep.
I think that's a really important data point, not in and of itself, but because what we're already seeing in a sense is the symptoms of that prolonged liminality, right?
Talk that out a little bit more.
Yeah.
How do you see that?
This has been a conversation at our church, and it's hard not to notice that leading up to Charlie Kirk's assassination, like right, oh gosh, was it before or after? It was actually after. Yeah, it was after Charlie Kirk's assassination that this crazed individual in Minnesota ran his truck into an LDS church, set fire to the church, and shot and killed multiple people inside. Right before that, there was the political attack and assassination of a representative in Minnesota. Before that, you could go back to Nashville the year prior or a couple years prior when a trans individual went into a Christian school. It was actually a PCA church in school. So our denomination, John and I know one of the pastors there, and shot and killed kids. Like, mass shootings are not new. Okay. Columbine happened, I don't know for you, John, it was my freshman year of high school, right? So that's not new, but the motive is. It's no longer about celebrity. It's not about like dying in a blaze of glory so that you'd be remembered. It's not about revenge. This is existential violence. This is morally, religiously, and politically motivated. And they're all what you were talking about earlier. It is an attempt to solve a crisis of meaning. And that's important. Or it's maybe not solve a crisis of meaning, but to
it comes out of a crisis of meaning for the individual.
Absolutely. It's a way of trying to exercise agency when you feel like you are trapped and constrained. And I'm not justifying any of this.
Right.
I'm saying this is actually a bigger problem than we even think it is.
Right.
Because prolonged liminality leads to greater volatility and inevitably leads to like a very nihilistic cultural environment.
Yeah.
And we've got to be prepared for that. If liminality is the new norm, if it is an ice age, then we have to be we have to expect that things are going to be radically different 3 years from now, but we won't know what they are. And how do we navigate that?
Yeah, well, I think we've got to lean into continually rethinking what it means to lead. And by that, we don't mean throwing out the playbook that the Bible gives us for leading as pastors.
If anything, it's retrieving it.
Yeah, if anything, it's retrieving it. But I think one of the words that's been on my mind probably the past 4 or 5 months has been the word stewardship, stewarding the moment through leading and stewarding the moment. And that's always been a thing. But sometimes, that there, for instance, and I think you might mention this, but for instance, if you're a church planner, you're leading entrepreneurially. But I think stewardship is an interesting word for this moment. So for me, I've had a context change. A year and a half ago, I was in Hollywood, Florida. Now at a church up in Boca Raton, Florida, about 30 minutes north. And the context is very different for me. So for instance, I was in a place that was what I would call urban diversity. And now I'm in a place that's more like cosmopolitan in its diversity. It's more grit versus sophistication. There's more academia where I am now. There's 2 universities that are just down the street. So where I was working class and then upper class with very few middle class. Now it's like upper middle class and upper class. But I also think the moments change. And this is actually, so as we're talking about liminality, this is something that I've actually had a hard time. Well, not a hard time, but maybe I've noticed the change. So for 10 years in planting, I was just used to a genuine spiritual antagonism towards Christianity. And since I've been here, I've seen a genuine spiritual curiosity. When I talk with people in Hollywood, I was very much used to and ready for them to bring up some of the deconstruction talking points, to some of the church is a moral blot on society talking points. And what I've seen here is just a general spiritual openness. Like, tell me more about the Christian faith. I want to know. And even in that, we've seen our student ministries here at the church grow exponentially from where they were even a year ago. It's just wild. So the attendance that we're having is incredible. And it's not just the quantity, though. It's really the quality. We're seeing junior high, high school, young adults, college students have a genuine spiritual depth to them. That's what they're craving. I joke around with our youth leaders that, we don't do cokes and jokes. We really want to take kids deep in the gospel and in scriptures, and they want it. And I've sat in and witnessed students pray and witnessed students study the Bible, and I'm like, this feels different. And so what does it look like to steward the moment where God is doing something among Gen Z, and I get to see it from a front row seat? It's really incredible. But I mentioned the entrepreneurial shift. So when you're planning a church, you're very entrepreneurial. You're breaking new ground. Here, I'm part of a church that was planted in the late '60s and has a huge campus. And so I think before I was trying to show people the value of the Christian faith to intrigue them and bring up their curiosity. And here I'm just guiding them through the Christian faith. They're already curious. And so those are some of the ways I'm thinking about stewarding, and I'm having to shift in terms of stewarding both who I'm shepherding and the moment and what God's doing in this particular moment. And so it's changed. It's different than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, it's fascinating because your change in circumstance was like oddly timed with, what people have described as a vibe shift. Like there's been a shift in culture at the same time your shift in place to happen. And so I can imagine that made it even like an even starker contrast, right?
Yeah.
Me, however, like I'm still at the table. We celebrated our 9th anniversary in August, and but at the same time, it's fascinating to me because we didn't realize until about August that actually it was we had this sense that like, hey, we're growing, but it's kind of hard to tell like what's going on with that. And by about the end of October, we realized year over year we're 30% larger as a church than we were a year before. Now that's 30% of like, a little over 100 people. And so we're flirting with 150 on a Sunday morning now. But for a church, that's a significant growth. But it's fascinating because it didn't feel like dramatic or anything. It is just this very slow, steady over the course of a year. And I think a lot of that, like as we've been processing this as a staff, like trying to what is going on with that? I think it's because the incentives have changed. The same anxiety.
That's interesting to me.
Yeah, the same anxiety and just general stress and exhaustion people I think feel. It just feels like in a way that we did not that nobody would say was generally true for most people when we launched in 2016, right? Like there's a whole lot of turmoil and polarization. Like that was when Donald Trump was elected the first time. So it's not like there weren't some volatility, but we weren't exhausted from it yet. Like after the last decade, now we absolutely are. And if I were trying to plant the table now, I actually probably wouldn't, honestly, because I don't think I'd do a good job. I am the kind of let's face it, John, I've got the beard, the mustache. Like I'm a walking caricature of like an Acts 29 Reformed church planter, right?
I didn't want to say anything, but yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of hard for the pot to say the kettle's black, but
yeah, there you go.
But I wouldn't I'm a vision casting guy. I'm like an enthusiastic guy, and that's the kind of like leadership vibe I feel.
Yeah, as my teenager says, your co-host has Riz.
Oh yeah, man.
She literally did say that.
I'm gonna, if I ever write another book, I'm putting that on the jacket. And with your daughter's name, it's gonna be awesome.
Yeah.
No, that kind of leadership and way of planting a church is a terrible idea right now because people are not looking for excitement. They're looking for stability. They're looking for I need a refuge. You might even say a spiritual greenhouse in the midst of this inhospitable environment, increasingly unhospitable environment. And we've talked as a staff, and we realized that pre-pandemic, the people who were darkening the doors of our church and were coming and looking for something, a lot of them were refugees of evangelicalism, right? Refugees of either evangelical culture indirectly and frustration and discouragement from that, or like direct experience with an evangelical church. Now, by far, we're seeing refugees of secularism and the emptiness and exhaustion of the world right now. And so that's a really both. We're still hopefully as a church, a refuge for people.
Yeah,
but things are resonating very differently, and different things are resonating right now. Yeah. And so, but it's interesting, you talked about, this kind of spiritual awakening that you're seeing, last year's, TGC conference. I was on a panel with Jared Wilson and Gavin Ortland, and
I was in the audience.
You were, yeah. It was packed. It was amazing. But I think it was the last question that was asked was, there's a lot of people talking about, a spiritual, like a quiet revival. And, people are coming back to church. And are you seeing this? And if you are, where are you seeing this? And, Gavin Ortland was like, I am seeing that. That's pretty amazing. People, I'm getting emails all the time from people who are coming across my YouTube apologetic ministry. And that's amazing. Jared Wilson was talking about, like, I'm seeing this in my church. Here's an example. And when it got to me, I was like, I hate to be a wet blanket, but I'm not actually seeing that. Like the refugees of secularism that I was just talking about. A lot of them are, Christians. A lot of them are like really skeptical still. But I would not characterize our growth as a revival, or like people who were not familiar with the faith or part of the faith coming to faith. And I think, and what I said in the moment was, I think this is actually, I think that's okay. And that doesn't mean it's not happening in some places. If anything, this is a good example of how we are not synced up like we used to be. And the fracturing that I'm talking about. Yeah. And I think different contexts, different places are going to be increasingly experiencing the things like the news and the events of the world in remarkably different ways. And in our context, which is highly progressive, I just don't, and also, even though it doesn't feel like it to most people who are living here because the cost of living and housing is so high, this is a relatively wealthy place. And so there's a lot more opportunity to pad the bumpers and to mitigate you the anxiety using money and what money provides for you than a lot of places. And so I'm interested to see how that kind of unfolds, but I do think, nobody should be like in the business of predicting the future. It's a good way to just be wrong. But I think that's even less possible than we're used to it being. Like it's even more unclear than it has been.
Yeah, agreed. I was going to make a joke about my fantasy football team and how bad I've been predicting their season, but we'll move on.
That's good. I'm so glad you didn't do that.
Yeah, right. I'm glad I never said that. Glad I didn't mention it. Well, that's exciting. That's actually exciting because it gives us the opportunity. You know, the Post Everything's never been about giving people certainty about what we think is going to happen. We're not prognosticators. We're just question askers, and we've got a lot of questions that we want to ask as things have changed even since the beginning of the podcast to here we are in season 6. I'm curious to try and figure out what's going on and do our best to say maybe it could go here in the future and see what could be downstream for us culturally from this moment. So season 6 preview, we have covered a lot of territory in a short amount of time. Let's try and boil it down to a few things, a few categories that people can take away as they think about going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, if you weren't at the beginning of the episode kind of feeling the anxiety that comes from ambiguity in our liminal age, you probably are now. And just to maybe validate that a little bit and reassure you that like we're trying to give an overview here of like describing the context for what we're going to be talking about in season 6, right? So because we don't get context online in most places, we're trying to describe that context accurately, right? But if that is the case, what is encouraging and hopeful is even though we can't predict the future, we have an incredibly rich treasure trove of ways to understand the world that we're living in and even the liminal age that we're deepening into. And when, it's not an accident that the New Testament's primary like paradigm for understanding our place in the world and therefore the starting point for how we make sense of the world is that spiritually speaking, we are sojourners and exiles, right? And so in that sense, what we're describing and the experience that we are in the midst of right now is actually apocalyptic, right? In the sense of revealing and exposing. And what's revealing and exposing is that maybe the age that we are coming out of, let's say pre-2012 to 2015, before that period, that was the exception. That's not the norm, actually. That was an incredible gift of relative cultural ease for Christians, and we're entering into an age that has a whole lot more overlap with the New Testament church in the New Testament era than the church of the last 75 years. And that's, not great. We maybe didn't appreciate the golden era we were in before, but that means we actually have some even more potent resources and paradigms for understanding like how do we move about and operate in the world. And that is because we are citizens of the kingdom of God. That means we are sojourners and exiles in the world. And that actually is expected. God told us that that's going to be the case. So that actually isn't new. Yeah.
No, I mean, this goes back to some stuff we learned in season 1 about adaptive leadership. And now the permanency of that. But I think also, again, the church is the most important organism on earth, and it has been, and it will continue to be. And I've actually felt that the way that you've talked about how institutions kind of mitigate some of the anxiety of the culture. I have felt that being at Spanish River, just the sense of being able to make meaning of the world feels easier. inside the church, inside the institution. So we would encourage you to continue to center the church in your own life. Go to church on Sundays. If you're a leader of the church, continue to help people steward truth. The gospel is the...
Yeah, your labor is not in vain.
Your labor's...
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Your labor is not in vain. If you're a pastor listening to this, you are doing incredibly important work, and you're probably on the front edge of that actually being a lot more clear as what's coming down culturally down the pike becomes less clear. The importance of what you're doing in the day-to-day ordinary ministry of the church is going to become obviously more important.
Yeah. And part of that is because God is committed to use the church. And so whether you're in a season of faithfulness that doesn't feel fruitful, or you're in a season of fruitfulness, God is at work in the church. We've said it before. We'll close out by saying it this time. The church is God's plan A. There is no plan B. And so rest in that. Be encouraged as you steward this moment. Let's do it. But in terms of what's next for Post Everything, we've got some episodes planned, and we're going to launch officially season 6 in January. Our first release date will be January 7th. Now, we may have a short announcement, or we might have another mini episode leading up to that, but look for season 6 to officially launch January 7th. We're looking forward to it.
Take it easy.
Bye-bye.
There it is. I missed that.
Thank you for listening. If you found this episode helpful, text it to a friend. Please take a minute and rate this podcast. Leaving a review helps other people find us and connect. You can send us questions or feedback by emailing us at posteverythingpod@gmail.com. Thank you.